Hey guys, Mr. V over here doing a book review today for Beautiful Boy, A Father's Journey Through His Son's Addiction by David Sheff. So this book is a nonfiction memoir written by David Sheff, and it basically is about his son, Nick Sheff, who is addicted to meth, and the father's journey through it. Talking about Nick's life, and then talking about trying to get him to rehabs, and just the whole struggle that he had with his son getting addicted to meth. Not only with trying to get him into rehabs, but also the continual questioning of what did I do wrong, or what could I have done differently to help my son, and why is he on this really, really bad drug? So that is the main thing about what the book is about. Before I get into the review of what I felt for this book, you should know that I read a book called Tweak, which is by his son, Nick Sheff. And so I already knew who Nick was. So I saw like what Nick's perspective was, because Tweak was about Nick's perspective about what it was like being on meth and what he did and the stories that he felt. So I already knew who Nick was, but I really wanted to see what the father's perspective was, because in the book, he wonders, like, what could he have done differently, and just could he have done something differently? And it was very interesting going into it already having read Nick's perspective, but I just wanted you to know that I had already read it. So when I give a review, you will see that I do comment on it a few times. But this book, Beautiful Boy, is filled with many interesting stories. There's many interesting stories because he wants to give some background to who Nick was and his upbringing. And so he gives you like a upbringing of like growing up, what Nick was like, and even getting caught with like marijuana when he was in high school, or getting arrested when he was 17. But he also talks about like Nick growing up from when he was a time basically in like first or second grade on. I don't know the exact time, but he talks about from a very young age on. And the father talks about how he and Nick's mother got divorced at a fairly early age, and that how much it probably factored into Nick's stress. I'm not saying that alone caused the meth use, but that it did factor into the stress that Nick faced, because the mother and father not only got divorced, but the father does talk about how they lived in different cities. So Nick would only see his mother, every few months, and it was just tough things like that. And what's interesting in the book is that the author, David, he does admit that he only sees what he wants to see. And there is a criticism I have for that later, which I'll talk about later. But he only sees what he wants to see, and he does admit it, because at one point, he does think that like Nick loves the stepmom and really loves his new wife. And Nick doesn't really he doesn't talk about it much, but there is a possibility that Nick may not like the stepmom. And an example is from the book Tweak. It's not in this book, but in the book Tweak, Nick says how he didn't like the stepfather. So it is a possibility he didn't like the stepmom. I still think he liked it based off things the father wrote in the book, but there are still many unknowns, and the father admits that he kind of sees what he wants to see. So that's something very interesting, especially when telling the stories. And it does help to know that, because you do definitely wonder a lot, because there still are many unknowns, because you are reading about the drug use from the father's perspective. So there are so many unknowns, but it is very interesting, like taking like the third person point of view when reading it, and you're reading from the father's perspectives, and you're reading like the stories he's giving you, and you can kind of see that the father tried way too hard to just be the cool dad and be really cool, as he did many things to make himself seem really cool. And sometimes it was being a little too relaxed and not punishing Nick when he was in his teens. And you can see how this most likely contributed to Nick's drug use, because the father would kind of brush over it a lot, and kind of like when he'd get in trouble, just kind of brush over and be like, okay, you'll be fine in the future. And he tried to seem a little too cool. And one example is that after Nick got caught with marijuana, he even smoked marijuana with his son when he was 17. So it wasn't even like they were both like Nick was already in his 20s and he smoked with him. He smoked with him while he was 17. And you can again see how the father tried way too hard just to seem cool by doing that. And you can see a lot more as you read. I'm not going to tell you all the stories. There's many other stories he gives. But that's why it's very interesting when reading it, to take that third person point of view and be like, wow, okay, you can see certain patterns in the book that may have contributed to Nick's drug use. And there's not just one thing, there's many things you can see. And that's why it is very interesting when reading it. And one thing I also liked about this book is you learn a lot about meth when reading the book, because the father did a lot of research. So you learn a lot because you see like what happens when people are on meth, what different people did, how addictive it is. And he's talking about like clinical studies, but it's not boring. It's not boring, but he's talking about these like clinical studies to show like how people react on it. And this definitely helps. Like you see like a lot more, and it helps for people who don't know much about meth and how scary that drug is, like just how scary it is. And you just see like what the parents experience and just how tough that must be, and the continual questions he has in his mind. And you get to see all that in the book. So that was very interesting reading it. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book was that I wish this was a little more realistic. Now, I know this is a nonfiction memoir, so it is real. But I mean, I wish it was more realistic in that he saw way too much of the perfect life for Nick, like almost as the golden boy. He saw way too much of the perfect things. And you can see that when you're reading this. Like he always thought everything was always great in school and his friendships, and he loved his stepmom, and he was always super creative. Like he always talks about Nick being that way, that, oh, Nick had never had to worry about friends. He always had a ton of friends. Or Nick is always super creative, and he's always just seeing like exactly what he wants to see. And he admits that when he's talking about the stepmom, but you can see it, that he's talking about all forms of Nick's life, that he's just seeing exactly what he wants to see. And when reading this, I wanted to know about the good things that Nick had, but I also wanted to know about the difficult situations. He does talk about it with the divorce, but there are other difficult situations that Nick must have gone through that the dad is either not willing to admit or just not admitting it. He could just be overlooking it, or he's just not willing to admit it. And I think he had almost like the parent syndrome or type of thing like that, where just everything is so amazing about their kid and nothing can be bad. And there's some parents that are that way, that everything is amazing and nothing is bad. So I think he had some of that, because I think you can tell by reading it that he's overlooking some of the bad. Or he doesn't want to admit the bad. I don't know what it is, and that's why when reading the book, there's still a lot of unknown. I'll give you another example from Tweak, which is why I recommend reading it. But when you read the book Tweak, Nick says how he wasn't always happy. And Nick was upset when his dad was actually sleeping around a lot. And the dad never wanted to admit it because Nick was afraid that his dad was going to get diseases. So you can see Nick was not always happy. He wasn't always happy with his friends either. And that is why you could see that the dad, despite a very interesting story, he didn't want to admit everything. And he didn't want to almost see what Nick saw to an extent. And that's why you don't get the full story, because there is still something unknown about it. And even if you didn't read Tweak, you can still tell by reading the book, there's something, he's just not admitting any of the bad, from Nick's from his childhood. He's not admitting any of the bad. So that's why you don't get the full picture, but despite that, you just wanted to keep reading. Like, I don't want you to think this is a bad book. You just wanted to keep reading. And I think you wanted to keep reading just because it is a well-written book. It's very straightforward. It's very easy to read. And he keeps you engaged with so many different interesting stories and different perspectives from what different parents told him as well. And they're definitely sad stories. It's very sad, but it is very well written, and you can see their perspectives. You don't know what you would do, but you can see their perspectives, and it does make you think like, okay, what would I do? As I just said, you don't know what you would do, but you do take a step back and you do think, all right, well, what would I do, and how difficult that must be. To where, I just thought this was a very interesting book, and I would definitely recommend this for people. And I don't think that you need to know someone who is a drug addict to enjoy this book. I say the complete opposite. I think everyone can enjoy this book because it was a very interesting book, and it's a very interesting look into addiction. As a lot of people know addiction and have some kind of addiction. Either you yourself have an addiction, or someone else has an addiction to TV or food or gaming or so many other things. There's so many things people are addicted to. So people are addicted to things that are not drugs. But you get to see like what the most extreme addiction is with meth. And you get to see how extreme this addiction becomes and how crazy it becomes for people. So I would recommend it. And if you're considering this book, I would also recommend that you guys read Tweak by Nick Sheff, because that is the son, and the son gives you the perspective from his point of view and what the son felt when he was going through these rehabs and like why he was doing the meth and all this stuff, to where I think you would definitely enjoy like both books together as you read one of the books first and then the other book, because I think they kind of work well as a pair. But if you guys have any questions or comments, please post it in the comment section below, because I'd love to hear your opinions. I hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different types of book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.